Good morning. It's good to see everybody this morning. Give it a couple minutes to get folks connected. Love seeing so many familiar faces hopping on.
Yeah, familiar names. I'm not seeing very many faces.
That's true. Folks are always shy on Monday morning.
Hey, Damien, put your camera on for a minute.
Fine. Oh, there we
Friend,
go.
how are ya?
Hey,
Good.
how's
How
it
are
going?
you?
Way to get called out on a Monday morning,
I comb my hair.
right? I like it. I like it.
Good
Good
work.
to see
Yeah,
you.
nice job. You can turn it back off. I just want to say hi. I'd like to say that there's a lot of people on here I'd like to say hi to.
Allow, was the glare getting you?
No, no, it looks good. I love it.
Yeah, y'all know I'm here, okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks for signing on.
Gonna give it another minute or so for folks to get signed on. It's good to have everybody with us today.
Brown, Meredith Helm, Jeff Mudrack. Look at so many cool people. Kelly's on here twice. Oh, she's on here three times. That's funny.
We've had a little bit of a hiatus from our webinars recently, but we've got a couple good ones planned. So, and excited to share about our comp trends today as well.
Well, we took a little break, had to go back to work.
We haven't taken a break on the work side, just on the webinar side.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining us. We're really going to talk today about some of the top trends that we're seeing for 2025 in compensation. And so, Andrea Beavin is our director of compensation and is really going to lead us through some conversations about strategies that you need to be thinking about in 2025 and beyond for making sure that we stay competitive in today's market. So, things like pay transparency and AI in compensation. And then we've got that huge FLSA change that's coming through in January 1. So I hope everybody's prepared for that. We're going to talk to that as well. So really going to focus on what data you need, what topics you need to be thinking about as we craft our compensation strategy for 2025. So um, I'm Candra Bryant. I'm the COO here at Hannah Resource Group. I also love compensation. I'm a comp girl at heart, but joined by Andrea Beavin to really lead and kick off our discussion. Andrea leads our compensation group here at HRG, but she's also got a significant background in compensation in companies like Mercer and Yum Brands and Transamerica. And so thank you, Andrea, for joining us today.
No problem.
We run a compensation for a number of clients across the state. We're not going to talk very much about us, but here's a few of the clients that we work with. A lot of our clients we work with are on an ongoing basis. So we don't just create compensation programs and base comp, sales comp, incentive comp, but we also maintain compensation programs for organizations and have many clients that have been with us for a decade or longer, where we've outsourced their compensation function to them, providing them with all of the up-to-date data that they need without having to go out to purchase those salary surveys, which can be pretty expensive individually. So proud to be supporting some of these clients and excited to see some of them here today too. I think one of the things we have to think about as we kick off this compensation discussion is really thinking about where are we now and where are companies as we really look to finishing out 2024 and looking at the beginning of 2025. And working with the organizations that we do, I am seeing a stabilization of the market. We're certainly not in the demand for talent that we have been in the past. Things are certainly starting to stabilize out quite a bit as unemployment numbers go down. But we're still on edge. We're still really wondering what's going to kick next. And I think the geopolitical conflict, the tensions in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, the changing global supply chains and disruptions that are in that critical area, all of those are really heightening inflation and reducing our global growth projections. So really making companies think about where they're putting their dollars and if they're going to be able to sustain these significant increases as we've had the past couple of years. There's also this technological uncertainty with where AI is going to go, especially with the rapid adoption of AI programs. We're seeing companies that are looking to do more and using AI as a way to replace some of those basic entry-level functions within organizations, and really using AI both in that space, but then also in innovation in some highly technical skilled areas too. And so the technological shift with AI is also bringing some uncertainty within our workplaces too. So companies are a little more hesitant than they were in the last couple of years in terms of thinking about how much money they're going to be increasing salaries and increasing pay programs across the board. You agree with that, Andrea?
Yes, definitely.
Okay. Right. So I'll kick it over to you to really talk about some of the trends that we're looking for 2025 from a comp perspective.
Okay. Yeah, so one of the big ones that has really occurred due to the sort of realignment of everything over the past couple of years is looking to pay a living wage. And what is a living wage? A living wage is basically enough money for a person to afford a decent standard of living. And as we all know, with high inflation and not keeping up necessarily with that, which is what we've been telling you all, is that it's impossible to probably keep up with that, but is to really look and see what we can do to make sure that our employees are at least making a living wage, in which case they will be better employees, right? So a lot of this is due to the cost of living increases. It also aligns well with companies that are considering, different human rights and other considerations in their comp policies. And ultimately, if you can afford this, your long-term workforce stability will be better. It will reduce your turnover and it supports your brand reputation. So while we're looking at, almost 70% of employers see paying a living wage as a priority, and they're looking to do this, not overnight, but within the next 5 to 6 years. And hopefully living wage will also come down in that time period. But this is just a little message from L'Oreal, committed to achieving living wage by 2030, and that it's really helping to play a role in the fight against poverty and to really keep bolstering that middle class in the U.S., which is such an important part of our economy. So we'll go to the next slide and you'll see that, there's two things that compensation professionals have always looked at. The main thing is cost of salaries. And that is, what is the wage rate in a local area? It's usually based off market competitiveness. We use market data or salary surveys to determine this. And this has been a big part of how we design our compensation strategies and philosophies. And there's also this piece, though, that cost of living, which we've always said, while they're correlated, not necessarily something that you want to use just purely as cost of living, because as you'll see in our next slide when we get to it, it's very volatile. And the problem right now is the volatility is going up at this point. So, but we do need to start considering it to make sure that our employees have some financial security and are able to meet their standard of living to the point where they don't have to worry about housing and food, so they can come to work and actually be productive. So this is a chart, as you can see. Um, I'm going to date myself. I started back in the early 80s. We were just coming off this high inflation rates in the 70s. And this is what the chart looked like back then. And so this was sort of the beginning of my compensation career. And then from probably mid 80s until just recently, within the last 4 or 5 years, it pretty much looked straight. Little bumps here or there, but generally speaking, other than 2008 when we had the market crash, but that, kind of didn't really impact the cost of living CPI as much as we've had seen in recent years. So one of the reasons why we've always gone with salary increase budgets is that it's a lot more predictable and stable, which is something a company needs. Whereas the CPI goes up and down pretty, with the economy, and we have little control over it. So you'll see now we're actually at the point where CPI is getting lower, and the salary increase budgets, while they're stabilizing, they're still not down to the rates of that 3% we've seen in the past.
So what do we need to budget for next year?
So next year. So these are different companies that run surveys for companies on what they're going to budget for next year for their salary increases. So this would be the overall increase. It will include any salary increases the company is going to budget for. So COLA and merit and anything else that they might have in there. So we have 5 different companies here who ran surveys. Some of these are a little more recent than others. World at Work is the big one. They do a big one every year. It's very, has lots and lots of companies in it. It's global, but we're only reporting US at this point. And they came back with 3.8, which is lower than what we've seen in the past couple of years, but again, still much higher than that 3% we were seeing for many years. The Conference Board actually came in a little bit higher at 3.9. And then you'll see the other ones. We have another one at 3.9, and then PayScale and Mercer were a little bit lower at 3.5 and 3.6. And I know Mercer's was really recent. They did what they call a pulse survey, and it just came out at that 3.6. So we might see the World at Work and those come down a little bit. But for now, I would budget at least 3.5. But somewhere between 3.5% and 4% is what we're looking at right now for 2025 salary budget projections.
Yeah, one of the things I found interesting too, we get this question a lot, is what about from an industry perspective? Are there certain sectors that are moving quicker than others? And so there are some of these do report on industry specific data, and I think high tech, life sciences, pharmaceutical industry, they're moving slightly higher, like a couple tenths of a percentage point, for example, where I actually saw healthcare was a little lower. Healthcare, retail.
Healthcare is a little low. I've looked at that for a couple of my clients because seeing that trend again in healthcare, specifically around the nursing side of the clinical side of things, that again, we're seeing harder to hire, harder to keep with current wages. And so I was a little surprised that they were a little behind. But I do think that some of that is because healthcare was higher the last couple of years. So they're a little bit higher than the rest. So they don't necessarily need to budget as much this year. But yeah, I was seeing between 3 and 3.3 for healthcare, I believe.
Is it okay to ask a question, or you want to wait till the end?
Go for it.
When you're getting data like this, does it assume a certain distribution of merit increase, like the top 10% or what have you? Is there a ranked philosophy or anything built into these types of models?
This would be the average budget increase they're going to give out. If they are using a ranked merit piece, they're telling us what their average is going to be and not necessarily what their distribution is going to be.
Thank you.
All right. So moving on from that, we'd be remiss to not include Gen AI and really utilizing Gen AI in comp administration. And so we're seeing a lot of organizations that are already using generative AI tools in all of their talent management, not just necessarily within comp. And I think it's one of the top concerns for executives in the upcoming year as well. It was for 2024. It will continue to be for 2025 as the pace in this industry moves quicker than anything we've ever seen before. So right now, in terms of how I've seen AI used in comp, one of the biggest tools that we're seeing, and I think a lot of folks on this call are probably using this as well, but creating job descriptions, utilizing AI, any sort of dynamic job matching within any of your salary benchmark data administration tools. Any sort of automated pay equity audits, it's amazing what we can see from an audit perspective when you really have Gen AI tools look through or comb through the data to look for any pay inequities. I think we'll see a lot coming forward in 2025 from a forecasting and a budgeting perspective from AI. I think there's a huge opportunity. There's a number of companies out there, more than I can even count, that are talking about personalized total comp packages utilizing AI, all the way down to let's look at your entire benefits usage data and select a benefit plan that directly aligns with how you and your family might be utilizing that data. Communication plans with AI, and then really streamlining compensation management. When you really think about comp, you think about benchmarking and updating salary structures, even executive pay. When you go out to the market to really define your industry and your market, a lot of that can be done with AI. So where we might have to spend a lot of time in the not-for-profit sector, for example, utilizing and reviewing 990 reports and pulling data directly from specific systems from 990s and identifying a peer group, AI can do that for us now in a matter of seconds. So some of the data that's out there shows that 40% of companies were already using AI at the beginning of 2024, another 40% picking up AI in 2024. So really by the end of this year, 80% of US organizations are using AI for admin skills, insights, talent management by the end of the year. And a lot of the times we're using AI, we don't even necessarily know that we're using it. I got to the privilege of leading a conversation with a group of HR professionals across the state. A couple of them are on here today in the government, municipality sectors on practical AI tools that HR is using. And one of the examples I gave was in Paylocity. So a lot of the platforms, the HRIS platforms, not just Paylocity, there are others, that you can actually generate job descriptions directly in the system. So this is a snippet from their tool. All I did was I went directly in the Paylocity system. Let's say I wanted to create a new job within the role, and I said, create a job description for an HR generalist, and I copied and pasted the benchmark match. And directly within the Paylocity tool, you're now able to generate it and actually create, I scrolled like I could have, like I was actually in the system. You're actually to create the generated job description directly in here, and then make changes directly in the Paylocity tool and apply that generated text. So it's really interesting to see how we're not just necessarily bringing on new AI tools within the organization, but how these tools are going to be integrated into everything that we're already using. So really brings to the point I had to talk about the challenges and ethical considerations if your organization hasn't already done this yet. You need to be thinking about, as an organization, how are we going to handle data privacy? How are we going to handle making sure that we are rolling out policies that don't create bias and are fair for all of our employees? What type of transparency are we going to provide employees with when we're using AI? And it's really those three things, I think, along with accountability, build on employees' acceptance and trust of using the system, making sure that we still have that empathetic human component to it, but also that employees know what AI is being used for and how it's generating things. I would ask for a show of hands, but we really ask for how many organizations have adopted an AI policy. And in that conversation I had on Friday regarding AI, it was shocking to see that very few companies have actually adopted a policy on AI. So from a compensation perspective, it's going to be integral in how we move forward, but even broader than that, from a business perspective, it's going to be integral in how we move forward. So making sure that we adopt some policies and procedures on how companies are going to be using AI moving forward is key. All right, we're rolling through here. The third priority, Andrea will walk us through.
Yeah. So we're going to look at pay equity and pay transparency. They are somewhat related in that part of pay transparency is allowing employees to understand why they're paid what they are, and therefore understanding that you do have a pay philosophy and that you are fair and equitable with your pay. So 70% of the U.S. organizations are actively implementing measures to address pay equity in 2025. So they are looking at allocating money to make sure that any gaps they have among similar roles are addressed, and that there are certain industries which are looking at even more than that. And we'll go through a little bit about what you want to look at when you're doing a pay equity analysis. But basically, we're just making sure that similar worked roles are making similar amounts of money. And then there's all sorts of legislation out there around pay transparency. One is disclosure of salary ranges for job openings. And I'm sure if you're using any sort of recruiting tool out there, you're finding that you can't go in there anymore and just say, this is the job, salary will be discussed, at another point. So that has been added to salary history bans. Many states and other places are saying that, you cannot ask your people that you are interviewing and looking at for jobs what their past history has been. And then the pay equity studies, as we talked about, and we'll go through that a little bit. So those are the things, and there's many different other laws out there, state by state. Kentucky's not there yet, but for those of you in Kentucky, we'll certainly keep you up to date with any new pay transparency or pay equity laws that go into effect.
Yeah. I know if you've got employees in Massachusetts, Minnesota, and Vermont, there are pay equity laws coming in 2025, or expansion of current laws that are already on the books.
So addressing pay equity, obviously, first thing you need to do is understand your data. So you need to collect and gather data, and you need to define comparable work. So hopefully within your pay program, you have grades or market data or something that will help you understand, what jobs are similar in around pay as well as market. And so those are what you want to look at first. So you want to look at folks who are making, that should be making around the same amount of pay because they're defined as comparable work. You can't compare, someone who is working as an accounts payable clerk with the CFO. Obviously, we see big headlines around that. There's this big discrepancy in pay between this and that, but you really need to look and say, well, of all the jobs that should be paid similarly to an accounts payable person, what do those individuals look like when you consider their pay? Set a benchmark for fair pay. Fair pay, as we discussed, should at least be what is the market rate, and then we also need to consider some things around geography and then cost of living a little bit factors into that now. And then you analyze the pay data. It's as easy. It's not as easy, but easy enough to look at comparable jobs to comparable jobs, all the employees you have in there, rank them high to low, see where your outliers are, and see if those individuals have anything that would define why they should be paid higher or lower than their peers in your organization for reasons outside of performance or other things that experience or things that should be factored in when you're considering pay versus other demographics that should not be considered.
Andrea?
Mm-hmm.
Are you running into any friction with companies wanting to pay less for more re workers in remote areas that are similarly situated to, say, someone who lives in an urban area in terms of the jobs? Let's just say IT, insert whatever title here. Is there, how's that
Geography
going
is,
down?
yeah. So with the work at home situation,
Yeah.
or work remotely jobs now, there is definitely some differences in how you look at geography.
Mhm.
Most clients are looking at still looking at sort of where their home base is and basing their pay ranges on that. And if
Mhm.
they're allowing someone then to work remotely, they might consider where they're at from where they sit, but a lot of that, the cost of living piece of where you live. I mean, if you're choosing to live in a high cost area or a low cost area, but working for a company that's in, a medium cost area, I mean, some of those things you already have, right? You probably already have your housing. You already have, you're already buying food and those types of things. And then you don't have the cost of having to have transportation into the city and maybe wardrobe type of things because people tend to wear, more casual when they're at home. So I would say it's still a consideration, but it's really more around where your offices are and slight differences for those that are working remotely and not looking at every individual and making pay decisions based off where they're actually living and working out of.
So you're not running into businesses trying to discount that you live in small town Wisconsin, for example?
I haven't had that happen, but a lot of my clients also are in small town something. So,
Okay.
they're already dealing with that.
Mhm.
But no, I haven't. I mean, because I have some clients in some bigger cities, but I mean, usually Cincinnati is sort of the bigger one, and it does pay a little bit more than Louisville and Lexington. And so I do have some companies have geographic differentials for their offices that are in or around Cincinnati versus Lexington or Louisville. But no, I haven't had anyone that said they live in, Podunk, Wisconsin, and so we're not going to pay them as much as we pay our other employees.
Thank you.
Especially when it's the choice of the employee. If the employer is requiring them to be there and they
Yes.
search and set the search to be there, then in that case, typically from a comp philosophy standpoint, we're requiring that employee to be in X market, so we're going to pay based on X market.
Makes sense. Thank you.
All right. The next topic is pay compression. This is a topic that's been going on for the last 3 years or so, and it's still occurring. So, what is pay compression? Pay compression occurs when you have a new hire or an employee, a new hire or someone just promoted in, or those types of things, whose salary is similar or greater than the salary of the more experienced employee who's been in the position doing the role in your organization for a longer period of time and doing it well. So what's happening is, there was this great reset where everyone was leaving their company to make more money with someone else, and there was bidding wars. And it's calmed down a little bit, but the whole point of still, when you need to make a new hire, folks are coming in and saying, this is what it requires for me to come and take your job. And if you're looking at your folks and you're saying, this also can happen with minimum wage, and it's going to also happen some with the new DOL exemption minimums as well. So we'll talk a little bit about that. But it's really being caused by this rapid inflation, high cost of living, the rise in minimum wage for many states, the new minimum state threshold, or minimum salary threshold, sorry, merging of companies, and then just, this all happened quickly. And at one point, people were just hiring people in and saying, we have to pay them what we have to pay them. And they didn't deal with the pay compression then. So now they still have that issue that they need to deal with at some point. So this is a little bit dated information. It's from 2023, but I can tell you, dealing with folks, people are still experiencing this quite a bit. But this is new hires, which, were within the last 18 months, and looking at their pay versus the tenure employees for, again, comparable work and pay. jobs. And you'll see that, at that career level, you're looking at 104% to 102%. So it is an issue. And people are, like I said, at one point, people were like, we don't care. We just have to do it. We'll just pay them. But then as that has settled down a little bit, you need to look at it now, especially as you're doing your salary budgets and looking at all these other things that we just talked about, pay equity and pay transparency. But you need to also then say, is there something we can do during the salary process where we can maybe fix this situation a little bit, between those new hires or recently hired versus your tenured employees?
Do you have any employees that have budgeted separately for compression, much like we are for pay equity?
Well, I don't know that I would say they actually budget, but as we get through a project and we experience it, then we go through and show them that these individuals probably need to have a larger increase of the budget. And so that budget then pops up just because of that. Obviously, tenure is not your only factor, performance is as well. And you can bring in new hires, obviously, that have tons of experience. It's just a matter of, especially at lower level jobs, it just doesn't seem fair if I've been with you and loyal with you and I'm making X dollars per hour, that you would bring in someone new, who maybe had experience somewhere else, but not with our current company, that's going to make more than me.
And you touched on this a little bit, but the new DOL exemption threshold is going to make this more challenging.
Yes.
So
anytime you have to sort of and I don't want to say artificially, because it's not that maybe people shouldn't have been making this much, but a very rapid change in compensation due to legislation or some other reason, is going to cause pay compression, because you're going to have folks that are barely over that threshold. And then you're going to have folks who maybe are way below that threshold that you're going to be giving a big increase to. And then they're going to make very similar amounts or same exact amounts of money. And again, that throws off your internal equity.
So we wanted to take a little bit of time to go through again. If you've been on a past webinar, we did talk about the differences in FLSA, but this is going to be such a huge challenge for organizations that are coming through. If you haven't budgeted for this yet, this is really your time to listen up, because the clock is ticking. The time is now. So since FLSA was passed, it had these white-collar exemptions for overtime requirements. Non-exempt jobs are required to pay overtime. Exempt jobs, you do not have to pay overtime. That's on a weekly basis and hours in excess of 40 hours per week. That's the federal law. There are 3 different tests for determining whether or not a job is exempt or does not have to be paid overtime. That's a salary level. So how much are they making? A salary basis, which is, are they paid on a salary basis, or are we paying them by the hour or by the piece? And then their duties. So what exactly are they doing? Because you actually have to meet a threshold of duties in order to be paid on a salary basis as well. And so what's really changing here is the minimum salary threshold, how much that employee has to make. And so it was $684 a week. When we moved to July 1, it went to $844 a week, or $43,888 a year. It's moving on January 1 to a pretty huge increase to $1,128 a week, or a salary of $58,656 a year. And so that's the 35th percentile of weekly earnings for full-time salaried workers in the lowest paid census region. And that's how the federal government came up with that actual amount. And so $844 a week to $1,100 a week is a pretty significant jump. And so if you have workers who are paid on a salary basis right now that are making anything less than $58,656, listen up, because you really need to think about what you need to be doing for them. Are we going to be moving them to this $58,656, or do we need to reclassify them as non-exempt employees? And so, to Andrea's point, we're now creating compression entry issues with this entry and mid-level range for our exempt positions within the workforce, which is going to have lasting effects both for higher paid positions and those that are lower as well. So can walk through each of these, but at a high level, these are the duties that you have to meet. So in order, as of January 1, you've got to meet that 58,656, and you have to meet the duties test. So you have to either manage the work of 2 or more full-time employees with the authority or recommendations to hire, fire, promote, pay decisions, etc. Or you can meet an administrative exemption. So this is your work has to directly correlate to the general operations of the business, and you have to exercise discretion and independent judgment. And this exercise of discretion and independent judgment, there's a test for that as well, but it's basically, can you make decisions on behalf of the business that hold particular weight within that organization? A learned professional is your job requires an advanced degree, so think lawyers, doctors, etc. Creative professional exemption is a job that you are inventing, imagining, creating. Think designers, artists, writers, those type of things. Computer exemption is someone who likewise is creating, programming, or developing applications. So think software engineering, systems analytics, computer programming, really creating, techniques and procedures, designing, developing, testing, modifying computer programming. So you've got to meet that new 58,656 and hit the duties test as well. So if you have employees that fall underneath that threshold, you really need to think about, do I want to move them keep them exempt, or do I want to potentially move them and reclassify them as a non-exempt employee, which would be an employee that is eligible for overtime. We have had a few employees that didn't necessarily want to rock the boat and move them to hourly non-exempt employees where they're paid by the hour. So instead they're doing something called salaried non-exempt, where they're continuing to pay them a salary, but then also paying overtime anytime they work time and a half on top of that. So it's really kind of the best of both worlds. You get yourself in a pickle with that over the long term if you don't want to necessarily keep up that practice, but we do have a couple of clients that chose to do that as well. So I think right now it's really looking at the job duties and responsibilities for your role. If you have any folks that have been on the fence from an exemption status perspective in the past, now's your chance to make corrections. Now's your chance to have the difficult conversations because our law is changing already. Really identifying those exempt and non-exempt positions within the organization who might fall below this threshold, and then deciding whether or not you increase your salaries or reclassify those roles. So increasing salaries, obviously you're increasing your payroll costs for the organization, but if you anticipate a lot of travel within that role, or if that role makes and earns significant overtime, you really just need to look at the cost benefit analysis of doing that, is what we're recommending for employers to do. And it's pretty easy. You just lay it out. You look at the current salary. How much will it be till they meet the new threshold? On average, how many overtime hours do we think this individual would be working? We're not tracking it because they're exempt employees. And then analyzing that pay with what they would have with overtime. And then determining, are we going to pay more within overtime, or are we going to determine to keep them in a non-exempt role? Andrea, you want to talk about some considerations?
Sure. So one of those considerations is, so when you go through and you lay out that and you decide which way you want to go, if you decide to move them up to an exempt level and that causes an increase, obviously you're going to have to look at that from a budgeting perspective. And if that's going to be, taking away from others, but then you need to look again at internal equity. So you could be having some compression issues at this point then, because you have, longer tenured employees that are going to be making the same or very close in amount. And so is there any way you can create that spread in there based off performance and experience and tenure? The other thing is if you have any certification or skill-based pay programs where you actually increase pay because they became certified or because they have a skill that you have. And so that's part of your pay philosophy, is that, you know, if you have a position where if they get the certification, they actually get a $1,000 increase in their salary, that gets wiped out by this, right? So you could have a new person coming in that has to make the 57, you know, almost $57,000, and then they would get the $1,000 when they get their certification, where the folks who already had the certification that got moved up to 57 would, you know, that kind of got wiped out from that standpoint. So just need to make sure that if you have any of those programs where you actually pay because of skill or certification, that you have to revisit how those folks who already have received that in their pay are impacted based off the change. And then, I mean, obviously there's lots of other considerations you have to look at, record keeping, timekeeping, employee morale. There are going to be people who are very, you know, upset about this. They see this as a demotion. One of the things you can possibly do for them is keep them salaried if possible, non-exempt salaried, as Candra had said. And then any policies you have that are differentiated between your exempt and non-exempt employees, you know, that might be considered negative as well, especially if it's vacation or time off policies. Folks moving down to that other group might not be happy about that. And they'll tell you, I don't care if I'm not paid this amount of money. I want to stay exempt. And, you know, have to have that difficult conversation with them. Less difficult in that it's mandated by the government. So, but still, and because of this, we'll go a little bit further. We don't know whether it's going to go through or not, but I would be very prepared to make this move, but not necessarily pull the trigger onto it until the end of the year, because walking this back is no fun. And so again, at this point, just like everything else we do, we don't have a crystal ball at this point. I would say we're much more favorable that it will occur than it won't. But there's still a possibility, a small one, but still a possibility it could be overturned. And so as you're making these changes and getting ready to look at this, you definitely want to have that set for as close to December 31st as you can.
Yeah, recent conversations I've had with friends in employment law, we are not attorneys, but in employment law, I would say 4 out of 5 attorneys that I actually talk to do think it will go through. They think that because it's effective as of January 1, it will be hard to walk back at that point. And the new administration, no matter what that looks like, no matter where the election goes, even if it changes, might not have the time to then.
Well, I just also think that, you know, the DOL kind of learned that surprise attack last year, and so they've been in front of a lot of that.
Yes.
So,
with last year, you mean 2016?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
Last time this occurred, that was a surprise. You know, they were surprised, I think, that occurred. This time they've, you know, done their due diligence, hopefully, to make sure that this is considered lawful. I would say that maybe this is a step where it needed to be. I don't obviously agree that it's just a hardship for companies, as we all know, to go to almost double, you know, I mean, you know, that weekly range. And but we have time, we still have time to make sure that you're in compliance at this point and have those conversations with your employees.
Going back to our trends for 2025, paying a living wage, which I think updating our exemption threshold is a step in that direction. Pay transparency, pay equity, pay compression, all 3 of those kind of together, and that you need a solid base pay program before you can really work towards equity, transparency, and compression. And then the last one being AI and really using generative AI as a means to ease administration, not just necessarily within compensation or even within HR, but across the business as a whole, as a leading trend for 2025.
Yeah. And salary increase budgets, making sure you have enough money to do all of these different things that we just talked about, in addition to, budgeting somewhere between 3.5% and 4% overall.
Right.
There are a few questions in the chat.
Sure. What you got?
You kind of may have answered some of these too, but what if the organization would rather choose the non-exempt and pay the overtime rather than switching the whole group to be exempt?
As long as they're paying overtime, then technically they're still non-exempt. Is that the question?
No, I think the question that you might have, I've had this with some clients who feel like there's a certain job where certain people within the job are performing at an exempt level. And there are other people within the job that are not performing it at an exempt level. And I can see how that could happen. Certain jobs are varied usually, but I, from my purist comp standpoint, would say if that's going to be the case, I would put them in two different jobs and call one senior level and one non, and and keep your jobs pure, non-exempt and exempt, and don't base it off of this job is either or depending on what the person makes.
I agree.
You can do it. Like you can I think you can do it under the law, but from an administration standpoint, that's a nightmare.
Yes. Yes, they could even still stay in the same grade. But if that's, a concern, but you just, and you obviously may need to make sure that the ones that you do go ahead and make exempt are at all the different levels of exemption, right? All the different tests that we just talked about, as well as salary. But yes, legally you can do it, but I just, from a purist standpoint, I feel like a job should either be exempt or non-exempt.
Seems a little cherry picking. The other questions about current litigation that might prevent this from going through. Like we said, there have been a few challenges, I believe, but nothing significant to derail it thus far.
Nothing that I've heard is still moving forward.
Yeah, like a lower court.
Something new that came up if it
Yeah, like a lower court, I think, upheld that the Department of Labor has the authority to enact stuff like this, because that was the first challenge. And then the other one's about if this will be emailed afterwards, which yes, we will. We will have the materials either up on the website or out in an email in the next day or so. So they will be available later.
Any other questions before we sign off?
I do have another question. So I think my additional question is in regards to morale. We had the July switch over, which affected some of our population, and the January is going to affect a much larger group of our population. So if the company decides based on the criteria that they want to go ahead and just have people become hourly, we noticed in that first run, the morale it hit the morale a bit, and I think it's going to hit it again in a larger scope. So what are your suggestions for, it's almost like it was like, okay, well, we'll just take the chance and do it. What have your other companies, how have they handled the morale of that?
Are you talking about moving folks to non-exempt that are currently exempt?
Correct.
Yeah. I think communication plan, which truly states we're doing this because we're required to by, federal law. The federal law has changed, and being very open, honest, and transparent about what that means. And then doing everything you can to reduce the stigma of an exempt job somehow being better than a non-exempt job. Like I understand that that's there. It's prevalent in a lot of organizations. I would say most organizations. But I think as this law changes and more roles are going to be moving to a non-exempt, I think this is just the first wave of hopefully what's seen as a true culture change in that aspect.
Also, the government actually thinks that they're doing these folks a favor
Yeah.
because they are now eligible for overtime. So, I mean, you can play that a little bit. I don't know if they're going to be doing a lot of overtime, but part of it is that, now if they are required to work any overtime, they will get paid for that. And so that is the whole point of it, is that, we feel like you should be working a standard number of hours and that you shouldn't have to do 60 hours of work to get a job done. And if you do, you get paid for that. So that is, even though we all know that is kind of not necessarily the message employees want to say here, that is the point the government is trying to make, right? That
Yeah.
if you work more than 40 hours a week, you get paid for it.
I also would make sure from a policy and procedure perspective and a benefit perspective that we're not treating exempt and non-exempt employees any differently. So trying to mirror the same policies, so not having a different vacation time policy or PTO policy for your exempt versus your non-exempt staff, for example. You want to make sure that we apply consistency between both classes of jobs.
Yeah, I think you did a really good job getting that part of it. Where we got the pushback was that managers of certain groups, now the managers had more work to do. They felt like, oh great, now we have to do the timekeeping, now we have more work to do. So that's where we got our pushback was, oh my gosh, now we have to track all this. So
yeah,
that's hard for them.
Finding a really good tool that makes it easy for them.
Okay.
Yeah. It shouldn't be administratively burdensome to do that. So there are a number of HRIS systems out there that make time tracking really easy to do. It's even on your mobile device. You can send out a push notification to a manager to review and approve hours on a cell phone. So, yeah. Great. Good question. Thank you. Before we sign off, anything else?
I was gonna say, well, speaking from 2016 experience too,
Yeah.
I think the big thing with the managers is letting them, I don't know, guiding them to have conversations with their teams about what expectations around work looks like going forward if they're moving from exempt to non-exempt, and maybe you're not in the position to offer a lot of overtime. So now the people are going to be doing, work under more restricted conditions, right? So maybe they're not going to be as productive, or maybe they're not going to be as they would have been when they were exempt. And just kind of having those honest conversations as teams, like, what is this going to look like? How are we going to do our work, knowing that we can't go above 40 hours a week or whatever on a usual work during a usual work week.
Yeah. Thanks, Chase. All right. Well, thank you for joining us today. We'll get this up in YouTube here in the next few days. We'll certainly send it out as well, or we'll send out a link to our website to be able to see the slides and the presentation as well. And if you have any questions related to anything we talked about today, anything comp related or just general HR questions, never hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.